Okay, I think we can start. Good evening, everyone. Those of you joining us in Moscow. Good morning, those of our colleagues in the United States, and good afternoon for everyone in Europe. My name is Maxim Suchkov. I'm director of the Center for Advanced American Studies here at the MGIMO University in Moscow. Needless to say of how delighted and honored we are to host Her Excellency Ambassador Rouz Gёttemüller. She, of course, needs no introduction, especially in the world of arms control, and most of our audience today in this from this industry. But obviously, I'll have to say that her career record is amazing, and I think it's twice as amazing when you come to think of the types of professional challenges that female professionals face in this policymaking industry. Ambassador Gёttemüller was Assistant Secretary for Arms Control Verification and Compliance ever since 2009, and she was the Chief Negotiator of the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, also known as the START Treaty. She also served as Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security and Deputy Secretary General of NATO. And she is currently paying distinguished lecturer at the Center for International Security and Cooperation and Research Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Wow. I made it. I'm also delighted to be joined today by my colleague, Andrei Baklitsky, who is also a well-known scholar in Russia, and actually, I would say one of the most amazing emerging scholars worldwide in the industry of arms control. We'll usually run this book talk series as follows. Our guest gets we invite our speakers to talk for about half an hour. Then our discussant weighs in on his own impressions of the book. And we then provide opportunity for the speaker to reflect on the comments, and then we'll turn it over to Q&A if that's okay. Before we start, let me actually share a story, one personal story about Ambassador Rouz Gёttemüller that I'm sure she does not remember, that took place 10 years ago, exactly in the spring of 2011, I think 1 year after the signing of the START Treaty between US and Russia. And at the time, Georgetown University and MGIMO hosted a conference on US-Russia relations where Ambassador was one of the, I think, the keynote speaker. And I was back then a Fulbright fellow at the Center for Eurasian, Russian, East European Studies, writing my PhD dissertation under the auspices of Professor Angela Stant. And after following remarks by the ambassador, we kind of lined up for Q&A. And I asked her the question that I remember brilliantly, but I unfortunately do not remember what the ambassador answered to me. And the question was basically, the arms control industry is such a complicated politically and technically of a domain. But ever since the Cold War, US and the Soviet Union and now Russia are somehow able to find the ways to work in this domain and come up with some agreements that usually are more or less beneficial to both sides. How was it possible, I said back then, that in other domains, Russia and the United States cannot find a mutually beneficial agreement, whereas they can find this agreement in this complicated domain? Now, I say, I don't remember what the ambassador answered to me back then. Perhaps I was so proud of myself asking that question that I didn't get to listen, or there was, 10 years have passed. But I find that answer true even today. And with no further ado, Ambassador Gёttemüller, thank you so much for being with us, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Maxime. That question is still very relevant today. I'd have to think about it a minute before I answer it, so maybe we will hold that for the Q&A period, but we're definitely able to return to it. Thank you so much, everyone in Moscow, for joining today. I see the names of several friends and colleagues on the screen. I'm glad you could be here. Thank you too to participants in Europe, and one or two colleagues and friends from the United States I see have joined us. So really appreciate that you can be with us today. I'm very, well, I will say delighted to have a chance to speak to this audience about the book. It's just coming out in print finally this week after a long effort. I have to say the pandemic, as sad and tragic as it's been for the world as a whole, was actually good for writing. So I had the opportunity after arriving at Stanford in January of 2020, I practically dove into writing it right away. And I'll tell you honestly, I think it was in my head for a long time. The years I was at NATO working as Deputy Secretary General, I was thinking through the experience and reflecting on it, as well as the years after 2011 and the entry into force of the treaty while I was still serving as Undersecretary of State. Because it is a story of the long-running and continuing success of the Soviet Union and the United States, now the Russian Federation, and the United States in being able to grapple with the problems of nuclear weapons, these weapons of mass destruction that pose such a dire threat. And after the Cuban Missile Crisis, I think both the US government and the Soviet government at the time realized that we were facing such a dire threat from weapons, this weapon of mass destruction, that we needed to be serious about placing limits and constraints on these systems. So it started slowly with the strategic arms limitation process in the 1970s. And then, of course, there have been fits and starts. It's not a perfect history, I would say, Maxime, in that there are many periods when we were not able to make progress at all, including, and I'm thinking here about the early years of the Reagan administration, but it was Ronald Reagan himself then who turned, I will say, turned up the level of effort in the United States, as well as Mikhail Gorbachev in the Soviet Union in those days. And we were able to achieve in the 1980s the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, as well as early in the 1990s, the so-called START I Treaty, the first Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. So it hasn't been an even history. There have been hills and valleys throughout, but I do agree that it has been a steady but slow progress over time, where both of us have been able to bring down the level of warheads significantly. When I think about the height of the Cold War, the United States had built over 30,000, approximately 32,000 warheads. And I understand the Soviet Union had built over 40,000 warheads. And in the ensuing period, we have been able to bring those numbers down considerably. And just in the number of deployed nuclear warheads, when START entered into force in 1994, we each had approximately 12,000 deployed strategic warheads. But under the new START treaty, we are down to 1,550 deployed strategic warheads each. So I do feel again that there has been steady progress with fits and starts, with stops and starts, but nevertheless a steady progress, and it is something to be proud of. There is a long history of negotiators, both on the Russian side and on the US side, writing about their experience in negotiations. Some of them have been very, I would say, technical in nature, going into great detail about what happened at the negotiating table, the ups and downs of the various negotiating positions on both sides. I chose to do it differently. I wanted this book to be very much about my personal experience as a woman negotiator, because I am the first woman to be negotiator of a strategic arms reduction treaty between our two countries. So I wanted it to be a story of my experience, but I also wanted it to be a kind of insider's tale that would talk about what it was like working on the delegation and with the delegation. The reason for that is rather simple. I'm not sure how it is in the Russian Federation, but in the United States of America, that experience has been lost somewhat. There's not a good memory of sustained delegation work in the United States, the kind of sustained delegation work that I first experienced in 1990 and 1991, when I went out to the START negotiations in Geneva as a young State Department staffer. I was on an international affairs fellowship from the Council on Foreign Relations, and so was able to participate in the START delegation as a young State Department staffer. It was a very good experience. I frankly say in the book that I learned everything I know about how to organize a delegation from that experience. So it's an experience I value very, very much. But I also then wanted to tell how things have changed in the ensuing decades. And quite honestly, even when you think about the details of delegation work, in 1990, we were using Xerox machines to make paper copies of everything because electronic email systems did not exist. When we came to the New START negotiations in 2009 and 2010, of course, on the US delegation, we were steadily exchanging emails every day to update each other on what was happening in the negotiations. No need for those Xerox machines to be burning up paper all the time to provide what the daily uptake was on what had been accomplished at the negotiating table, because of course, every day you do have to keep the treaty text updated, you have to keep the protocols and annexes updated so that everybody knows what's the latest text that you're working against. So it's interesting just the details of that phenomenon, that so much had changed in the years and so much in terms of electronic communications had developed that we were able, I think, frankly, to move the negotiations along a lot quicker than we otherwise would have been able to do. Even the existence of mobile phones, it was quite difficult in 1990 because, people used the phones on their desks. There were very strict hours. I will say in the Soviet mission, when you could get through to the telephone on the desk of the executive secretary and make arrangements for the next meeting. So it was a very complicated matter. But from the outset, I told my own executive secretary, you need to have the mobile phone number of your counterpart in the Russian mission. And if we need to set up a meeting on a Saturday, you need to be able to get in touch with him. And it was agreeable to both sides because my Russian counterparts felt the same way. We had two presidents breathing down our necks, two presidents very keen to replace the New START treaty by December of 2009, because START, the first strategic arms reduction treaty, was going out of force in December of 2009. And so both President Obama and then President Medvedev agreed in London in April of 2009 that we should try to get the new treaty finished by December of 2009. Now, you will recognize that that is unprecedented speed, because the START treaty that I worked on in 1990 and 1991 took almost 6 years on and off to negotiate. But we didn't have that kind of time. And I think there was that urgency in both Moscow and Washington that really meant we had a good, I would say, pace on the delegations in Geneva, and we were working very fast and very hard. But that pace was really helped by the fact that we had electronic communications. Something so simple as having our mobile phone numbers shared between the two delegations, that we could get in touch when we needed to and schedule the meetings when we needed to. So that was a big change. And I think, frankly, it helps not only in negotiations between the United States and Russia, but watching what goes on in Brussels these days in NATO and in the EU. Having that kind of mobile communication really helps in negotiations across the board, I think. And so it is a great advantage from the earlier days. Now, in terms of the relationship between the US and the Russian delegations, I will say, I think we were, again, very much helped by the fact that our two presidents in London issued us early instructions and really issued us instructions that we were to work seriously and fast to get the new treaty finished. So that was very beneficial. But I do think that I was also helped by having been the director of the Carnegie Moscow Center for 3 years before I became the chief negotiator for the new START treaty and joined the Obama administration. I went almost straight from Moscow, December of 2008, finishing up with the Carnegie Moscow Center to interview with Secretary of State Clinton in January of 2009. And then I was confirmed by the Senate in April of 2009. So it was a very fast progression from having been in Moscow for 3 years to the time that I started working as the chief negotiator. Why is that important? First of all, I think it's important that we had done so much work at the Carnegie Moscow Center in those preceding 3 years. I had put in place a kind of continuing seminar where I invited experts from the United States, both Democrats and Republicans, to come and talk about their thinking, their expectations for the next stage of nuclear arms negotiations. And I think, although those weren't official talks, it does show the value of track 2 and track 1.5 kinds of interchanges, in that we were already, I think, both in Moscow and Washington thinking ahead about what might go into the next treaty. And that was very helpful. But I think the most important thing for me personally was that I got to know my counterpart, Anatoly Antonov, currently the Russian ambassador to the United States. I know now back in Moscow, but at the time when I was in Moscow, he was the head of the directorate in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that deals with arms control and non-proliferation matters. And so from time to time, I would invite him to come and speak at the Carnegie Moscow Center. From time to time, I was also on his informal advisory council, his expert advisory council. So I would go to meetings sometimes at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or we'd have lunch and have a chance to exchange views informally. And I think that acquaintanceship really served the negotiations well, because oftentimes when negotiators meet each other for the first time at the start of a negotiation, they may not know each other at all. And they have to kind of figure out what the other personality is like, what their characteristics are as negotiators, how they use language. And all of these things can take time. I call it the kabuki dance of getting down to business in a negotiation. But I think that Ambassador Antonov and I had formed an acquaintanceship, and we already somewhat knew what to expect in terms of the person on the other side of the negotiating table. That doesn't mean there weren't games played. Ambassador Antonov's a very skilled diplomat, and he told me right at the outset that he loved to play games. And boy, did he play some games sometimes that were really meant to try to knock me off balance. But again, that's what happens in negotiations. That's natural in a negotiation. And I always say two can play at that game. So I try to do my best also to play some games on him and on the Russian delegation. My favorite was the fact that he had many talented young women diplomats on his delegation. In fact, he was very proud of the fact that he had been able to attract a number of women to come work in his directorate. And they always ended up sitting in the back row. They were never at the table, and they were never allowed to speak during the plenary sessions. So I started immediately saying to him, you should bring your talented young women to the table. You should allow them to speak. And then I started to send some little gifts down to the women on his delegation. For example, I sent them some White House Christmas ornaments, and I sent when Carnival came, Mardi Gras time came in February, I sent some Mardi Gras beads down to the Russian mission marked very prominently. These are for the women on the delegation. And then I began to get some remarks from the men saying, well, where are my presents? Where are my beads? Why are you paying so much attention to the women on the delegation? And I have to say, it sounds like mischief. It was mischief, but these are the kinds of little games sometimes in negotiations, partly in fun, but partly to try to knock your counterpart off balance a bit. And this is the way I think it's very natural to think about negotiating processes. But the other thing I will say is that we both were aware we had to be very much in a problem-solving mode. And especially after we failed to get the treaty done by December of 2009. And we had just a few months in after the start of 2010, we really had to work intensively through that winter of 2010 to get the treaty finished by the spring. And both of us were aware that we had to be very much capable of solving problems and getting through difficult issues on the delegation and making sure that the treaty text was moving forward on a steady basis. I apologize in advance. The team has just arrived to cut our grass outside, so there will be a little extraneous noise for a few minutes as the gardening team cuts our grass outside, so apologies for that. But I would say that the most difficult aspects of the negotiations really had to do with some, I would say, as always, differences of substance. From the beginning, the Russian delegation was not eager to have a detailed verification regime, verification and monitoring regime. They had received from President Bush, from his administration in October of 2008, quite a loose proposal for the follow-on to the START treaty, where the Bush administration had said, we aren't really interested in having detailed monitoring and verification issues. At the time, the Russian government had been very skeptical and had gone back to the Bush administration and said, no, we need to replicate at least some of the verification measures of the first START treaty. But by the time we got to the Obama administration, Moscow had changed its mind. And that happens again quite often in negotiations. And the Russians came to us and said, no, we prefer the Bush proposal. We don't like your proposal. We prefer the Bush proposal. And we had to tell them, well, look, that was that administration. This is now the new administration. And President Obama and President Medvedev agreed that the new treaty, and this was in London in 2009, the new treaty would contain limitations on delivery vehicles, missiles, bombers, on launchers, but it also would contain limitations on warheads and the verification measures that are needed to monitor such limitations. So we were able to insist on that, but it was an interesting example of how oftentimes, both countries, I would say in the history of these negotiations, both countries switched their views 180 degrees from time to time throughout the negotiations. So that was an interesting and difficult issue to get through in the first couple months of the negotiations. The other interesting and difficult issue that presented itself throughout the negotiations was the relationship between strategic offensive and strategic defensive forces. From the first, I would say, plenary meetings, we began to hear from the Russian delegation, from Ambassador Antonov, that there had to be limits on missile defenses in the treaty. But when President Obama and President Medvedev met in London in April 2009, they agreed, and our instructions stated that the new treaty would be about limiting strategic offensive forces. And so that was the instruction from the highest level. And there were no instructions saying that we needed to limit missile defenses. So I kept repeating this again and again and again, but it became clear that this was a political imperative in Moscow, that there be something about missile defenses in the new treaty. And so I suggested that we acknowledge the relationship between strategic offensive and strategic defensive forces in the preamble to the treaty. It appears there, and it is an important acknowledgement because there is a relationship. If strategic defenses are built up too strongly, then they can begin to undermine the capability of strategic offensive deterrent forces. And so that is an important point to acknowledge, but it was not one that we were willing to incorporate in the treaty in terms of actual limits on missile defense interceptors. And this was a very difficult issue throughout the negotiations, but we were constantly able to refer back to the discussions, the early discussions between Obama and Medvedev and their first instructions to us. I will say that we were not ignoring the issue by any means. And in fact, there was another venue that was overseen by my superior, by my boss, Undersecretary Ellen Tauscher, with the goal of discussing US missile defense programs, providing all kinds of confidence building and transparency, providing information about the direction of the programs. But these talks were carried out on a separate track from our talks in Geneva on limiting strategic offensive forces. Now I see I've been talking about my own experience for almost 30 minutes, so I will turn the floor over back to you, Maxime, and hear what Andre has to say. But I would say, I want to end by saying, and in answer to your question, I do think that we've had a remarkable history of being able to limit and reduce these terrible weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons. And I think the fact that we have been able to do so shows that we have we have an ability to work together and to cooperate, but I think it is important that always, and the reason any country comes to the negotiating table is that that country believes that measures to constrain or limit whatever, whether it's nuclear weapons or any other kind of behavior or hardware or software, it's because they believe that it is in their national interest to do so, and particularly their national security interests. So I think in considering the future of our relationship, we have to see what is possible in terms of both being in agreement that it is in our mutual interest to limit and constrain certain types of hardware, certain types of software, certain types of behaviors, and we will see what is possible in that regard. In any event, thank you very much for this opportunity. I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and a special thanks for kind of mentioning this female aspect of the negotiation and how you reached out to the Russian female. I think we have a few colleagues from MGIMO who are obviously females in the IR, and also a couple of colleagues I see from the Russian Foreign Ministry, some of our junior female diplomats. So perhaps your own story can come as an inspiration for them as well. So thank you for that. Just a reminder before I turn it over to Andre that you can either forward your questions to the ambassador in our chat box, or send it to me in a direct message here in the chat box, and I will read them on your behalf. Or if you want to ask the ambassador a question in person, please raise your hand, and I'll put you live when we come back to her comments. Andre.
Thanks, Maxime, and thanks, Ambassador Gёttemülлер, for taking the time to speak to us. And I just will start with saying that it's a fascinating book. I read it. It's very easy to read. It's very well written. So I read it in a couple of days, I guess. So I encourage everybody to go get your copy. It's available in electronic copy, so there's no problem of getting one in Russia. It's a pity we don't have a similar book in Russian about the New START negotiations. We have, of course, Ambassador Antonov's «Контроль над вооружениями. История, состояние, перспективы» from 2012, but it's like an overview. It has just a couple of dozens of pages about New START treaty and even less about negotiations. So I hope Ambassador Antonov will find time at some point to write his own account. It would be really interesting to read and to compare how those things looked from the opposing sides. I hope that some of the diplomats, including Ambassador, will read your book, and maybe I'll get some feedback from the people who were in the room to see how your account fits with their memories. But I would say it's a bigger problem. There is no book in Russian that I'm aware of which would tell the history of START 1 talks or the treaty, which was, very important, groundbreaking for arms control, but there's no account. And I don't know a book in English for this matter, which would be covering, the START 1. Luckily, Linton Brooks is still alive and well, and I hope that either he is doing something or someone is extensively interviewing him, because that would be very, very good to have as well. It's quite a big book. I don't think I will be able to cover all of this. It is really interesting from my point of view that it is written as your personal story, and there are some things which you wouldn't know if it not for your personal story. For example, I was very surprised for how much pressure there was coming from the White House and from the National Security Council, to do this or do that, and how that was impacting your performance. And I was very, very surprised that you considered resigning from your position as chief negotiator during negotiations, because again, you didn't see how that would go forward. And that's, things you don't necessarily think about when you talk about negotiations. You believe it's like two countries sitting on the table and negotiating over their interests, but we often forgot that those are real people who are doing their job. And again, those how you make a party to light the mood up a little bit because people cannot go back for Thanksgiving home, or how you interact with across the delegations, inside the delegation. This is all fascinating. On the agreement itself in the New START treaty, so we do have a couple of points in Ambassador Antonov's book where he says why this treaty is in the interest of the Russian Federation, why whatever criticism there might be is misjudged. So he makes a point saying that first of all, there is no, and I've heard it from people elsewhere, there are no extra limitations on Russian systems. So there are no limitations which were only concerning Russia, like merged systems or heavy ACBMs or mobile ACBMs, which United States wouldn't have. And I've heard from other military experts saying that this is the first fair treaty, which was treating Russia and the United States equally. And maybe that's why it's seen as something quite good in Russia, and maybe that's why there was no issue with the extension from the Russian side, not really issue, at least. Then there is, he was saying that the US side, personally was trying to shield ICBMs or SLBMs with conventional warheads from, being including in the treaty limits, saying that it should be a different kind of weapon. And the Russian side got it into the treaty, so those would be limited if and when those will be produced. As we know, that never happened, but in 2012, that was still a possibility, and that was seen as something that Russian side made happen. And quite an interesting point for me, and you write about this extensively, is the telemetry question, which is basically the most political part of this whole negotiation, because as you write and as other people have written, START 1 depended on telemetry, extensively dependent on telemetry, is the information which the missiles provide to the ground stations when they are tested, and which can give you a lot of information about this missile. One of them being how much throw weight does it have, how many warheads it can bring. So when under the START counting rules, those was important information, it was a vital part of the treaty. Since in the New START, the counting rules were different, you were actually counting the warheads on the top of missiles, telemetry was not necessary. But then US Congress came in and said that, no, we need some kind of telemetry. And how you were trying to explain to your Russian counterparts that it's like there is no reason for this to be included in the treaty, technical reason, but there is a political reason. And that we have to think of some kind of telemetry which would still be there even if it's not necessary. I've heard comments on again from the Russian side saying that that was part of the issue, and the other part of the issue would be that some of the people in the United States would love to have telemetry from new Russian systems, because even if it doesn't tell you about how many warheads it can bring, or this information is not necessary, you'll still get some interesting info which you can use for then feedback in your missile defenses, so you can protect from Russian missiles better. And the fact that specifically in the treaty it was written that Russian side would decide which telemetry it will be providing, and thus it will only provide the information about older missiles. It will not give out any secrets. So for example, when Avangard is being tested now, no telemetry from it is being transferred to the United States. So this is also seen as, Russian diplomacy standing for its interests. But it's interesting how you were trying to balance in the treaty the telemetry issue, which was a political question, not a practical question, and at the same time missile defense issue, which again in this treaty was not a practical issue, it was political, that you have to recognize it, and how you balance those two things that both sides were sort of fine with. And generally, I agree. Well, it's hard to disagree that there was a huge interest from both presidents on both sides to get this thing done. And time after time, when the issues were coming up, they were overcome because there was this push for the broader Russian and US government to go out there and find solutions. It is to be seen if the same will happen when the next negotiation happen. And if those things which happen all the time in the negotiation, the roadblocks, the disagreements where you cannot move forward, if those would just derail negotiations because there wouldn't be just enough political pressure or political interest, and one of the sides would just say that is not cooperating, they're trying to oversmart us or something, and how this will play out in the next negotiations. I really liked the part when you talk about the advice and consent procedure, because you're optimistic about the possibility of still having Senate to give advice and consent, even despite the fact that most of the people on the Republican side who were voting for advice and consent are out. I guess there is one or two still in the Senate. But yeah, if we're gonna have a treaty, either you would have to get advice and consent, or you would have to go to other venues. You can think about congressional executive agreements, which are simple majorities in both houses, in both the Senate and the House. And this would be, again, something which the next negotiators would have to think about. It may be not the simple way to go to the Senate and go the same old route. And probably the last point I just want to mention, so we'll have some time for Q&A, is the concluding part in which you retell the history of your lunch with Ambassador Antonov once everything was said and done, and you were discussing the possibility to continue your negotiations. And I've heard this from Ambassador Antonov himself before the book was out, that he proposed, and he was really pushing this idea that we should continue talking, that we concluded the New START treaty, but there are other issues and we could just continue discussing them, and that never happened. And that's a pity, I believe, because we haven't had negotiations since. You were right, we had previously breakdowns in talks between Russia and the United States. We never had such long breakdowns in talks. As of May 2021, it's like, it's been a while, and we're not sure when we'll be able to start this sustained negotiations again. And before I yield the floor back to Maxime, just a broader question. So the book, your book is about New START negotiations, but I wanted to raise a connected but slightly different issue. You were the Assistant Secretary of State for Arms Control, Verification and Compliance, which meant that you were the head of AVC Bureau, which is like 100 plus people doing all sorts of things, all kind of arms control, not only with Russia. And how did you manage to run the AVC Bureau with a full-time job negotiating with the Russians in Geneva? And a follow-up question to that, do you think this is sustainable in the sense of next negotiations should be run by Assistant Secretary of State, which, by the way, has not been even named in the Biden administration after 120 days in office, or you would need some kind of presidential envoy separate from Assistant Secretary job, because this is, it really looks like impossible task to run. And thank you.
Thank you, Andre. It looks like you're eyeing similar career, right? And want to get a tip of advice on how to manage this complicated chessboard. But thank you. That was a good comment. Ambassador?
Well, thank you very much, Andre. You put your finger on some of the major issues. If I may just comment first on your comment about telemetry. Indeed, we considered it a confidence building measure in the new START treaty. It's not necessary for confirming that the obligations of the treaty are being met, and that's the basic point. Those who said we need broad-ranging telemetry on the U.S. side, I would say to them, and others on my delegation would say to them, it is not needed to confirm compliance with the obligations of this treaty. If you've got other reasons out there why you want telemetry, yes, of course, our intelligence agencies, your intelligence agencies, they'd all love to have as much telemetry as they can get. But if it's not needed to confirm compliance with the treaty, it's not relevant to the treaty. And that's a hard message, I think, for both sides, especially when you are trying to make sure that the treaty stays within its confines, it stays within the structure for which it was designed. And there are particular obligations, obviously, in the treaty that have to be respected and complied with. But all those other requests coming at you about information some people would like to have, tough. They need to find it some other way. It's not going to be in the treaty environment that they get that information. But it was very political. You're quite right about that. I tell in the book about how we had a visit from two very prominent senators, from Senator Kyle and Senator Feinstein. They came to Geneva. They spent 3 days with us. They also met with Ambassador Antonov and the Russian delegation. That was an interesting lunch because the generals on the Russian delegation were, I think, not used to hearing from American senators, and they weren't very happy about it. But in any event, we got through the visit, but it became very clear from that visit that telemetry was going to be important as a political issue and that we would have to find some way to incorporate it into the treaty. That said, the Russian side, and you were quite right to talk about missile defense as also being then a political issue in the treaty. And naturally enough, the Russian side at the highest level, at the level of President Medvedev, began to link missile defense to telemetry. Okay, you want something on telemetry in the treaty, we're going to need something on missile defense in the treaty. And so we worked it out. It wasn't easy, but we worked it out. And I think I joke in the book that President Obama and President Medvedev became real experts on telemetry. They're both lawyers. They both, get into detail, and they were ready to dive in on the issue, but they started joking with each other. Oh, not telemetry again. I think they were tired of talking about it, but we finally did get enough on telemetry into the treaty that we got the advice and consent of the Senate. And I assume it's the same on missile defense for the Russian side, as it also gained the advice and consent of the Duma and Federation Council. Okay, your two questions are good ones. There are different models in the US system for this. I had an excellent principal deputy assistant secretary. Her name is Karen Look. She's now retired from government, but she is an extremely experienced State Department hand. She really knew the State Department much better than I did, frankly. And so she ran the State Department, my Bureau of AVC, in my absence in Geneva. And it was a hard job. She had a very, very difficult job during the 9 months that I spent in Geneva, but she did it beautifully. And so it is possible if you have an excellent principal deputy. And I think, frankly, Anatoly had some similar problems because he has a big directorate in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And I'm assuming that he had a good deputy as well who was handling matters for him back in Moscow. But there are different models out there. There is the model also of the presidential envoy, as you put it. And I'm not sure where this administration is going to come down. The Undersecretary, Bonnie Jenkins, is currently up for confirmation. I hope she will have her final vote soon. She's had her hearing already, and it looks like that final vote will be coming soon to approve her. And then they are going to move on to the assistant secretaries. It's taking longer than I would like, but that's somehow, it happens that way in Washington sometimes. Once again, I was the most urgent because I was going to work on this treaty that needed to be negotiated very, very quickly. I went up for my confirmation hearing. Well, I had started the process in February. I went up for my hearing in March, and I was not confirmed until April 4th. So even in this case where it was extremely urgent and everybody was pushing to get it done, and Senator Lugar on the Senate side was pushing to get it done, it took 4 months for me to get confirmed. So it's, well, it's the US system. I think it's important for the Senate to also give their consent to high-level appointees, political appointees, but it does take time. All right, with that, perhaps we should turn to other questions.
Sure, thank you very much. Well, before I turn the floor to other questions, I just, one thing that popped up in my head that I wanted to ask real quick. You know, I often hear that, you know, the arms control and especially, you know, nuclear weapons issue is no longer kind of a spine of US-Russia relations. It's kind of think of the past, and there are things like cyber or AI regulations or something like that that is going to be the new meat of the bilateral relation. Do you share this sentiment, or you still think that the things that you've been doing throughout your career are the major piece or the spine of the bilateral relationship?
Well, I'd say, Maxime, you know, the nuclear weapons arms control is the no-brainer in the US-Russian relationship. Both sides agree. We've heard from President Biden, we've heard from President Putin. They want to work on the follow-on to the New START treaty. So it's something that is outside the realm of politics in some ways, and the very difficult bilateral relationship that we have right now. At the same time, they also have agreed that they are willing and they want our two countries to talk about a broader agenda of strategic stability issues, some of which will include some matters of new technology. I'm not quite sure how cyber is going to fit into that, but you know, we do have a history of working extensively together on cyber confidence building and that type of thing. So I, for one, would like to see it become a part of the strategic stability agenda. We will see what happens, but there will be a number of technology issues, including things like hypersonic glide vehicles and some of the new kinds of weapons that the Russian Federation has developed. That will be a subject for discussion in the strategic stability talks. So I rather like the fact that the two presidents, when they talk about this arena, they talk about this agenda, they talk about a negotiation to replace New START, and then they also almost in one breath say, and it is necessary to talk about the wider agenda of strategic stability issues as well. So I welcome that very much, and we'll see where we can go. For the other aspects of the US-Russian relationship, again, a very, very difficult period for US-Russian relations, but I take my cue from the phone call that the presidents had a couple of weeks ago, where they also talked about Afghanistan. They talked about climate change. I assume that is going to involve cooperation. I hope cooperation on the Arctic. I note that Tony Blinken will be meeting Sergei Lavrov in Reykjavik at the ministerial of the Arctic Council, when Iceland will be handing the chairmanship to Russia for the Arctic Council. That's coming up on May 20th. So I think there are a number of areas where we can and should be working together that the presidents have already designated. Another one is Ukraine. And so let's see what can be done in this realm of looking for areas where we both have an interest, a security interest in cooperation, but we also have, I would say, larger objectives to solve some major problems.
Thank you. Well, let's turn the floor to our viewers, and first in line we have Sergei Semyonov, Program Coordinator of Russia and Nuclear Non-Proliferation at the PIR Center. Sergei?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Suchkov, and thank you for this amazing discussion. And I'd like especially to thank Ambassador Gёttемülлер for her amazing book. And it was a real pleasure both to read book and the leaked cables from the negotiations on WikiLeaks, which I think is a real manual on diplomacy, on arms control diplomacy. I really have a lot of questions, but I'll try to limit myself to only two of them. The first question deals with the counting rules for heavy bombers. As far as I understand, during the New START talks, the United States was advocating for the real counting rules for heavy bombers. I mean Russia and the United States have different storage systems. For instance, as far as I understand, the United States has its warheads mounted on the air-launched cruise missiles. In Russia, we store missiles and warheads apart. So given that the United States has voiced its intention to bring all nuclear warheads under the scope of the future arms control agreements, do you see this issue popping up in the future negotiations, and what are the prospects for its resolution? The second question I'd like to ask is about conversion and elimination procedures in the New START treaty. Russia was advocating for these procedures to be made less costly, less complicated, and as a result, in comparison to the original START treaty, we have sort of menu of options to eliminate New START accountable items. And I think as a result of that, we have these disputes ongoing in the Bilateral Consultative Commission regarding the US SLBM's launch tubes on higher class submarines. So I'm just interested in your opinion, whether those conversion procedures should be made more specific, more concrete in the New START follow-on agreement, or we should retain this model of a menu of options for conversion and elimination. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sergey, and thank you for taking note of Ambassador Nazarkin's book as well. In the chat, Sergey mentioned that there is a memoir by Yuri Nazarkin, the head of the Soviet delegation during START 1, and I've read that memoir. It's really interesting. So I don't know if it's in print still in the Russian Federation, but it's well worth reading. Yeah, and I do wish we had several U.S. negotiators. I think probably Rick Burt and Linton Brooks should get together and work on a memoir of START, but they were long negotiations, as I said, on again, off again for 6 years. So it would be quite a memoir. Very good, very detailed questions. Counting rules for heavy bombers. If you do not know, the counting rule for heavy bombers in New START is to count each heavy bomber as carrying 1 warhead, although obviously bombers can carry more warheads than that. It's complicated why we felt this was justified. There are precedents for proceeding in this way. But to make a long story short, it is felt that bombers have less possibility of penetrating to their targets. Therefore, it's justified to count them as having only 1 warhead rather than the multiple warheads with which they are loaded. That's oversimplification, but just to give you a small notion of the bomber counting rules, which are different from the missile counting rules, where we actually do confirm the number of warheads on the front of the missiles by physically viewing and counting them underneath covers that disguise the actual nature of the warheads. So yeah, we proposed, it wasn't a real count. It was closer though. It was a larger number. It was not 1 warhead per bomber. It was more warheads per bomber. We proposed that to the Russian side, and the answer was no, because of the delicacy, the sensitivity of confirming the presence or absence of warheads in particular storage facilities associated with bombers, adjacent to bomber parking areas, those kinds of things. I think, frankly, the Russian Federation at the time just didn't want to get into that level of inspection, of having American inspectors come into some of these sensitive facilities. So the answer was no, and we reverted to this bomber counting rule. You're quite right, Sergey, that the US administration is now proposing, did first under President Trump, a freeze on a total number of warheads that would over time have a monitoring regime associated with it. Once you take a unilateral parallel freeze and put a verification regime into it, then you end up having more of a negotiated limit. And I think that notion of directly limiting all warheads is one that the US administration will want to bring forward into future talks on this matter. So it does mean that both sides will have to be willing to allow for more monitoring and verification activities in sensitive warhead associated facilities. And it's not going to be easy for the US side either. So this, to my mind, is one of the most complex areas for the next negotiation to take on. How do we figure out, and I think it's possible to do it in a step-by-step way. Many of you know the work of Pavel Podvig. He's working on a notion that would carry forward reentry vehicle on-site inspection and New START for really focusing on operationally deployed warheads to begin with. You know, I'm not endorsing any approach, but I think, all right, that's one way to begin in a step-by-step approach. And then to build out from that with more intrusive warhead verification measures going forward in future. So I think there are a lot of possibilities. Again, I'm not speaking for the administration in any way, shape, or form. I do know that there will be an interest in proceeding with a limit on all warheads, and figuring out how to do that will be the most difficult, I think, aspect of the next negotiation. And as in terms of serie procedures with regard to the SLBM launch tubes, you know, frankly, I think we are quite close. From what I've heard, we are quite close to getting this resolved in the Bilateral Consultative Commission. That's the implementation body of the New START Treaty. Sadly, they haven't been able to meet over the past year because of the COVID pandemic. I feel like this is going to work itself out and can do so in the normal kind of implementation body, that it will not need to be a big part of the next negotiations. And so we'll see how that goes, but that is my information. And I do hope not only that the BCC can start to meet again, but that we can start to do on-site inspections again, because once again, COVID-19 has prevented on-site inspectors from going to facilities in Russia or coming to facilities in the United States. And I think that that is a situation that we should rectify as soon as possible.
Thank you. We have another question from our colleague who's a consultant to the PIR Center, Oleg Shakirov. Oleg.
Yes, Ambassador Gёttемюlлер, thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting. I want to continue the topic that Maxim has already raised about the emerging technologies. So I'm in particular interested in this cyber nuclear nexus. And there are several points I would like to raise. So whichever you feel comfortable in responding to, please do. So first, what do you think in the current context are the most kind of feasible parts of this equation that negotiators can address? So what exactly can they talk about? Second related issue is whenever people talk about cybersecurity in the international context, there are so many uncertainties, and sometimes it seems radically different from traditional arms control, where you have less uncertainty. So do you agree that it's more uncertain now? And from your experience, what are some strategies of mitigating these uncertainties? And maybe a third part of this question, how would you, like from your experience of organizing a delegation, now we see that these tracks, the cyber talks and the strategic talks are different kind of negotiating teams and different like traditions. So how would you bring those together for a particular issue? Thank you.
Thank you, Oleg. Very good questions. Well, we do have a long history now of working together. I mentioned it in my remarks on cyber-related CSBMs, confidence and security building measures. We had a long experience working together in the group of government experts in the UN. We've had also our bilateral talks that have extended for some period of time and have produced some CSBMs, notifications of various types, that type of thing. I think that has been a positive development. Interestingly enough, despite the fact that the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe has had a very difficult period, and I really, really urge Russian experts, and I think we need to think hard as well, what are we going to do to refurbish and modernize the Vienna document? I think it's high time that we think about what we should be doing on conventional CSBMs going forward, because this is an area that is completely, and the Open Skies Treaty is another very difficult topic at the moment, but we need to be thinking about what's needed today. I understand that it's not the Cold War and that the situation in Europe is much different, but what makes sense for both of our countries and for the countries of Europe, whether in NATO or outside of NATO? What makes sense in terms of conventional confidence building, incident response, early warning, these types of things. So I really urge us to be thinking about what we can do both in the OSCE and perhaps in some other settings on this topic. But you were asking about cyber CSBMs, and I'm just noting that despite all the problems in the OSCE with conventional arms control, in this area of cyber CSBMs, they actually did some very good work, and I applaud them for that. So I do think that that work should continue. There are well-established working relationships there, very eminent experts and diplomats on the Russian side, as well as on the US side, people who have been working together for a long time. That's one of the messages of my book, and that's the message of sustained delegation work. You begin to develop a solid working relationship so that you can solve problems, so you can get through difficult periods, you can get over barriers and figure out how to find some answers that make sense for the United States and make sense for the Russian Federation as well. And so I think we should take advantage of that joint experience we've had in the cyber realm. Where I see the need for new work, and this I think is something well worth thinking about. Now we are worried about cyber attacks on critical command and control structures, particularly space-based command and control structures, and that applies to the so-called national command authorities, the NCAs that control, are the command and control nodes for our nuclear arsenals. And I think we need to have some serious discussions about establishing sanctuary for those NCA nodes, establishing them as, basically keep out zones for cyber attacks. And we need to talk about what that would comprise, how we would assure that for both of our countries. I think we need, frankly, to bring China into this discussion as well, because it's in nobody's interest for nuclear command and control to be attacked and endangered, particularly in a crisis setting. It's an escalatory kind of momentum that is then applied. So this is one area where I think we need to do some new thinking and some hard thinking, and really think about how we can again establish, because space-based assets for many decades have enjoyed a kind of sanctuary status, and I'm concerned today in general. There's another conversation to be had about new technology in space, but perhaps we begin on this question of, can we all agree to preserve the sanctuary for the nuclear command and control for the NCAs, the National Command Authorities. So I think that's a good area to be working on and to be thinking about for the future. In terms of your question about organizing the delegations, I don't worry about that so much, because again, perhaps the cyber negotiators will be organized in their own delegation. If they somehow become part of a larger strategic stability discussion, there are always working groups on any delegation. And indeed, where the New START negotiations were concerned, we had half a dozen working groups that were off on their own doing their highly technical work. They would come and report to me and to Anatoly separately on the Russian side. And if they were having problems, if they couldn't solve the problems at the working group level, they would bring them to the two heads of delegation, and we would work to solve them, sometimes having to go back to capitals to find a solution. But that, to me, that's not such a difficult issue. It all depends on whether the cyber experts are brought into the strategic stability talks or continue to have their own venue where they are negotiating.
All right. Thank you very much. And off to our next question from our colleague Dmitry Stefanovich from the Institute of International Relations and World Economy, IMMO of the Russian Academy of Sciences. Dmitry.
Thanks, Maxim, and thanks, Ambassador, for such a great presentation and the discussion so far. I have two questions, actually. One relates to the topic you've already touched, the nuclear command control communications, and how those can be threatened by cyber attacks or probably by other types of attacks. And I recently saw a quote by some of, I think, US senators or Congress people that said that, well, nuclear command control communications is so important these days, so probably there is a need not to talk about nuclear triad any longer. Let's talk about 4 pieces of a puzzle. So do you think that this might be a way forward towards negotiations as well? Like, stop talking only about delivery systems. Let's talk about the system, the battle management systems that ensure that those are delivered, and try to agree on what not to do or what to do with this stuff to ensure that to ensure strategic stability, to ensure that both sides are confident in their nuclear retaliatory capability. And my second question would be related to, well, the fact of this book published by you, and also some stuff that was leaked to WikiLeaks and so on. How do you assess when is it okay to disclose details of such negotiations? Because we also see a fascinating volume of data distributed by, I think, FRUS, Foreign Relations of United States series by the State Department. We have WikiLeaks, we have books by former officials. Does it help future negotiators, or does it, well, on the or vice versa? Does it, well, make those negotiators more careful on what they say and what they do not say? Or, because from my perspective, I'd love to see a similar amount of data disclosed by the Russian side, but I understand that there might be different attitudes by different people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dmitry, and thanks for joining this call today. You know, your first question, I hadn't thought about it actually, and I don't know the statement by the congressmen and senators you referred to. I do have a particular attitude about success in negotiations, and that is that we have succeeded by pursuing a certain trajectory. I'm mixing metaphors here, but we've proceeded by keeping a certain framework around our negotiations. And in terms of strategic offensive force reduction negotiations, that is related to reductions in operationally deployed delivery vehicles, operationally deployed warheads. And for the first time in New START, as I recount in my book, we came up with a notion of operationally deployed and non-deployed launchers, which is proven, it's a complex idea, but it's proven to be very useful to both sides, I think. So having 3 limitations, focusing on the strategic nuclear triad and carrying that forward now in a new negotiation, to my mind, that's the best way to proceed. Because as I mentioned earlier, it's going to be really difficult if we begin to directly limit warheads, to try to place a direct limit on all nuclear warheads of some sort. Even with a phased approach or a step-by-step approach, it's going to be really difficult to negotiate those measures, and it will be time-consuming. So I would stay focused in that traditional arena for the next treaty. Again, this would be my opinion. I'm not speaking for anybody else here. Stay focused in that area where we can take advantage of all precedents set and figure out how to move forward. I think reentry vehicle on-site inspections, the way they've been conducted in New START, is a great way to begin to think about further warhead limitations going forward. So we have, again, some good precedents to work on. And then I think separately, let's consider what we need to do about preservation of the NCA, preservation of our nuclear command control and communications, as you added. And that's quite right, actually, that it should be C3. So I do think that it's better sometimes to put boxes around things and work on them as discrete problems rather than putting too many things together. Oftentimes people, in my opinion, who are not very experienced diplomats, not that I'm, the most experienced diplomat, there are many more than I, but there are people who say, well, why don't you just put everything together in a big basket and then you can do trade-offs among all these very disparate problems that you're trying to work on. And I say that never works, because you always end up getting hung up on something and then everything gets linked to that. And you don't make progress on anything because of these linkages. So I think if you keep discrete agenda items together, if you place kind of a box around them and work on them as discrete agenda items, you can make better progress. That's just my experience and my opinion. Well, it's interesting. A couple of you have mentioned the WikiLeaks. As a former US official, I can't officially use those WikiLeaks. And I wouldn't use those WikiLeaks because they were leaked. It was illegal to leak those WikiLeaks. I've never even looked at them. So I don't know what's in those WikiLeaks. But as I recount in my book, I do know that according to reports, it was the New START negotiating record. But I've never looked at them. And the way I did my book was to really work with the Office of the Historian in the Department of State. And I got official clearance for everything that's in the book. It had to go through an extensive interagency clearance process. So all of the agencies, whether the intel agencies, the Defense Department, the State Department, the Department of Energy, they all had an opportunity to clear on the book. So I think that's the right way to proceed. You need to follow proper procedures if you are using government information in the way I did. And otherwise, well, for one thing, I'd never be allowed inside the Department of State again. I wouldn't want that to happen. But I do think that's my answer to your question, that if one is going to write a memoir of this kind, then of course you need to follow the proper procedures, whether it's in the United States or the Russian Federation or anywhere else in the world. Because, well, that's just the way it is. In our country, you can actually have legal action against you if you know it's classified information and you use it as classified information in a book without getting proper clearance. So there's a danger there as well.
All right, thank you very much. We have one real last question from our colleague here at the Center, and then Andre will make a comment and then we'll wrap up, mindful that the ambassador has to go to another meeting that she has in about 15 minutes. The question from our colleague Igor Spirin runs as follows: taking into consideration the ongoing debate around GBSD, ground-based strategic deterrent, is it possible that it can become a bargaining chip on bilateral arms control negotiations?
I don't know the answer to that question. We are embarked on a modernization of our nuclear triad. The Russian Federation is just wrapping up your modernization of your nuclear triad. You put a lot of resources into it, a lot of investment, excellent new platforms rolling out and coming into deployment. So that is a complete process on your side. On our side, what we have is the program of record. And the program of record was established by President Obama in 2017. And it said we will move forward with the modernization of the nuclear triad. And that includes all three legs of the triad, including the ICBM force. So that's what I know. That's where we are. Of course, the Biden administration is doing a nuclear posture review. They will consider these matters. Frankly, I don't know where they're going to come out. There are matters of resources. It's expensive to modernize the triad. The cost of this triad modernization is already well above $1 trillion. So it's a big investment by the United States, and perhaps there will be some decisions about adjusting the nature of our triad. But to be honest with you, at the moment, I cannot foretell what exactly will happen with the nuclear posture review, and I definitely wouldn't want to speculate.
Sure. Thank you so much, Andre.
Yeah, I would like to thank Ambassador Gёttemülлер again for this very, very interesting talk. And I'm sure we could go on like this for much longer. I wouldn't want to spoil all of the interesting bits of the book. Go find and buy it, but both WikiLeaks and the way how their publications might have impacted the treaty is described in the book. And also there is a very interesting story about volcano. I wouldn't try to pronounce its name. The one in
Iceland?
Iceland.
Yes, that one. And how it impacted the negotiation process. One last point I probably want to make, and that's why I think this book is timely, and I think it's really should be widely read. It's when you at some point in the conclusion say that US is sort of tired of delegations, and you mentioned this during your talk, that when one of the people from the White House just said, why do we need those delegations? Can you just go there for 2 or 3 days and then negotiate everything and get back, and if you need you can go twice, which obviously is not how things work. Even with cell phones and emails and everything, you really need to have those long sustained negotiations by a lot of people. It wasn't even in my list of issues I would have that one side just wouldn't want to do delegations. I don't feel there is the same on the Russian side. I don't think anybody in Moscow doubts this issue, but Russia was always a little bit old school, especially in diplomacy. I hope that the Biden administration would understand that you really need to invest in this, in delegations, in spending time out, in prolonged negotiations, because it really seems like the only way to get to any kind of agreement. And thank you again for this talk.
Thank you so much, Andre, and I absolutely agree. That's why I have in my chapter on lessons learned at the end, where I draw my conclusions, I say you cannot depend on what I call drive-by negotiations. You really have to have sustained delegation work, and particularly when we are grappling with such technical issues as how we are going to monitor warhead limits. These are the most sensitive objects that either the Russian Federation or the United States of America has, practically, and how we are going to monitor and verify limits on them is going to take a lot of very careful work on both sides. And you just have to sit together for a long period of time to work through those details.
Well, Ambassador, thank you very much. I know you have a tight schedule, and you've had a tons of talks about your book, and we definitely wish your book the best sales. Thank you for making time in your busy schedule, and hope to talk with you on some other occasion. Thank you so much, and thanks so much for Andre and for all the participants for making time for being with us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Maxime. It's been a true pleasure, and thank you, Andre.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.